My name is Danny Reeves. I am 26 years old. I work as a probate clerk, and I found out my brother had forged our father's will on the morning the estate attorney called to say the second will was ready to be entered into the record. I should explain what the second will means, because it's the whole story, and it's the thing my brother spent 4 months not knowing existed while he divided our father's life between himself and his own reflection. My father died on a Thursday. By Friday, my brother Marcus had the will. He produced it at the family meeting like a man unveiling a gift, printed, signed, dated, everything in order, our father's name at the bottom in a signature I recognized but couldn't quite trust. And the will said what Marcus wanted it to say, which was everything to Marcus, with a token acknowledgement to me, $5,000 and a line that read, in language that didn't sound like my father at all, to my daughter Danielle, who I know will understand. As though being cheated were a personality trait I'd been assigned at birth. As though the quiet daughter's role in the family was to accept less and call it grace. Marcus stood at the head of the table and read it aloud to the family, our mother's sister, 2 cousins, our father's oldest friend, and I watched him perform grief and generosity at the same time, which is a very specific talent. He was so sorry about the terms. He wished Dad had been more generous. He'd do his best to make sure I was taken care of, in addition to the $5,000, out of the goodness of his heart. Everyone nodded. Everyone looked at me with the gentle pity you give the person who got less and is expected to be gracious about it. I did not argue. I did not cry. I did not stand up and say the signature looked wrong. I have spent my entire career processing probate filings, and I have learned the single most important thing that work teaches: the person who challenges a will at a family meeting, in the first week of grief, becomes the villain of the estate, and the villain never wins. I sat very still, and I said, "Thank you for handling this, Marcus," and I let him believe I was the daughter who understood. I want to describe what that silence cost me, because people imagine silence as easy. It isn't. I sat in a room full of people I'd known my whole life, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching my brother perform the role of the responsible heir with our father's stolen estate as his stage, and I said nothing. For 45 minutes I said nothing, while the aunties murmured and the cousins nodded and my father's oldest friend shook Marcus's hand and said he was a good son. A good son. I held that cup and I thought about my father in Ms. Okonkwo's conference room, signing the document that made this silence temporary, and I told myself, the quiet is not permanent. The quiet is a tactic. The quiet is what Dad taught me to do. I just had to hold it long enough for the system to work. Because my brother had made one enormous mistake, and he made it because he had spent our whole lives certain that I was the passive one, the grateful for scraps one, the daughter who filed things for a living and would never in a million years know enough about wills to spot a forgery, or, if she did, would be too meek to act on it. He didn't know that our father had called me, 5 months before he died, and asked me to come to the office of a lawyer Marcus had never met. He didn't know that our father, sitting across from that lawyer, had signed a second will, a real one, properly executed, properly witnessed, dated after the document Marcus was now waving around, that superseded every word of the one my brother had just read aloud to the family. And he didn't know that all it would take to enter that second will into the probate record and collapse his entire performance was one phone call from me to the lawyer who held it. Before I tell you what happened when I made that call, and what my brother's face did when the second will arrived, tell me what time it is where you are right now, and whether you've ever been handed less than you deserved and been expected to call it understanding. I want to see how far this story travels. I have to explain what I do, because it's the whole spine of this story, and it's the exact thing my family found too dull to respect. I'm a probate clerk. I work at a courthouse, and my job is to process the legal paperwork of death, wills filed for probate, estate inventories, executor appointments, the entire unglamorous machinery that determines what happens to a person's life after they're gone. It is not a career that impresses anyone at dinner. When people ask what I do, I say I work in probate, and their eyes do a thing, they soften, and they change the subject, because death paperwork is the career equivalent of being the person who cleans up after the party. But it taught me the one thing that saved my life: I can read a will the way a mechanic reads an engine. I know what a properly executed will looks like: the witness signatures, the notarization, the specific language that varies by state, the way a real testator's intentions read versus the way a forged document reads when someone has tried to imitate them. I've processed hundreds of wills. I've seen the real ones and the questionable ones, and I can tell the difference the way a jeweler can tell glass from diamond, not because of one thing, but because of 1,000 small things that add up to a feeling, and the feeling is almost never wrong. I want to be concrete about what that trained I actually caught. The bequest structure was wrong. A real will from a man like my father, precise, an engineer by training, would have included specific reasons for unequal distributions, because careful people explain themselves on paper. This will explained nothing. It just gave everything to Marcus and tossed me a number. And the phrase "who I know will understand" is doing a very specific job. It's a guilt deflector, preemptively framing any objection from me as a failure of character rather than a question of fairness. Real testators don't write like that. People who are forging a document and trying to head off a challenge write like that. I've seen it dozens of times in my filings, and that construction, every single time, turned out to be a sign that something was wrong underneath. When Marcus read that will aloud, I felt the feeling. Something in the language was off. Something in the bequest structure was wrong. My father was a careful man, a man who thought about fairness the way engineers think about load-bearing, and the will Marcus was reading was not the will of a man who thought about fairness. It was the will of a man who wanted everything for himself and had tried to make it sound like someone else's idea. The "who I know will understand" line was the tell. My father would never have written that. My father would have given reasons, or given equally, or given with conditions, but he would not have wrapped theft in a compliment and called it a will. I didn't say any of that at the table. I sat with my $5,000 and my understanding, and I waited, because I knew something Marcus didn't. I want to be fair, because fairness is the whole point of this story. Marcus was not born a villain. He was the eldest, the son, the one our family had always treated as the natural heir, not legally, but emotionally, in the way families assign importance to the firstborn son without ever saying it out loud. He'd grown up believing that what our father had built was, in some fundamental way, more his than mine, and when Dad died, Marcus simply converted that belief into a document. He didn't experience the forgery as fraud. He experienced it as correcting an oversight, making the legal reality match the family reality he'd always lived in, the one where Marcus was the important one and Danny was the one who filed things. My family built him to think like that. And they built me too, the quiet one, the clerk, the daughter whose competence was mistaken for passivity because she never performed it. And I think about the way my father saw Marcus, because it matters. Dad was not angry at his son. The second will was not a punishment. It was a guardrail. Dad loved Marcus the way you love a child you can see clearly. He loved him knowing that Marcus's self-image as the natural heir would outlive the father who could have corrected it, and that once Dad was gone, the only thing standing between Marcus's entitlement and my share would be my willingness to fight. And Dad knew I wouldn't fight. Not because I couldn't, but because I'd been trained not to. So he built the fight for me, in advance, in the only language that can't be argued with, a properly executed will, dated later, held by a lawyer Marcus had never met. My father didn't arm me with a weapon. He armed me with a filing. There were 3 moments I never let myself feel until that family meeting made me feel all of them at once. When I was 20 and told the family I was going to work in probate, Marcus laughed and said, "So you're going to be the one who sorts out what happens when people die?" That's cheerful. When I was 23 and helped a colleague's family navigate a complicated estate, saved them months of confusion and thousands in fees, and mentioned it at a family dinner, Marcus said, "That's cute, Danny." Like a real lawyer, but without the degree. And when our father got sick and I offered to help him get his affairs in order, because that is literally my professional expertise, Marcus told our father, in front of me, "Dad, don't worry about that stuff. I'll handle everything when the time comes." He said it warmly, with the confidence of a son who had never once imagined that his little sister, the clerk, might be the one their father would actually trust. Each moment was warm on the surface. That was the trap. Each one told me where I was supposed to stay, beneath Marcus, the grateful second, the one who understood. Then our father, quietly, without telling Marcus, called me instead. Let me tell you about the afternoon my father called me, 5 months before he died, because it is the most important afternoon of my life, and my brother doesn't know it happened. Dad was sick. He knew he was dying, not imminently, but certainly, in the way you know after the third opinion says the same thing. And he called me, not Marcus, and he asked me to meet him at the office of a lawyer named Ms. Okonkwo, whose name I'd never heard and whose office was 20 minutes from his house, and when I arrived he was already there, sitting in a conference room, and he looked at me and said, "I need your help with something, and I need you to not tell your brother." He said he'd been thinking about his estate. He said he loved Marcus, that he wanted to be clear about that, he loved his son. But he had watched Marcus, for years, and he had seen something in him that the rest of the family hadn't wanted to name, that Marcus believed what was their father's was, by right, his. Not earned. Not shared. His. And Dad was afraid, not dramatically, but with the quiet, structural fear of a man who understood load-bearing the way I understood probate, that when he died, Marcus would find a way to take more than his share, and that I, the quiet one, would let him. He said, "I know you. You'd let him have it. You'd call it keeping the peace. I'm not going to let you do that." So he'd drafted a second will. A real one, with Ms. Okonkwo, properly executed, properly witnessed, dated 5 months after the document Marcus would later produce, which meant, under the law, that it superseded any earlier will. And this will said what my father actually wanted, an equal split, 50-50, with me named as the executor, the person legally responsible for making sure the estate was administered correctly. Not Marcus. Me. The clerk. The daughter who filed things for a living. He chose me as executor because I was the only person in the family who actually understood what an executor does, and because he trusted me to do it honestly, and because, he said this, sitting in that conference room, "You're the only one I'm certain won't steal from your own sister." He meant me. He was saying Marcus would steal from me. He was saying it plainly, without anger, with the tired clarity of a father who loved both his children and could see exactly who they were. I sat in that room and I listened to my father sign a will that protected me from my own brother, and I cried, not because I was sad, but because my father, the man Marcus had told "I'll handle everything," had looked past the son's performance and seen the daughter. He'd seen me. And he'd put it on paper. He told me to tell no one. He told me to let events unfold. He told me, specifically, that when Marcus produced whatever Marcus was going to produce, I should sit still and say nothing and wait, because the second will existed, filed with Ms. Okonkwo, and all I'd ever need to do was make one phone call, and the system, the same system I worked in every day, would do the rest. Then he went home, and he lived 5 more months, and he died on a Thursday, and on Friday Marcus produced a will that left me $5,000 and the understanding of a passive daughter, and I sat at the table and I said thank you. I want to tell you about the 4 months between that family meeting and the phone call, because they were the hardest months of my life, and I need you to understand what waiting cost me. For 4 months, my brother administered the estate as though the forged will were real. He filed it for probate, and I, who process probate filings for a living, watched it enter the system and said nothing. He began distributing assets. He took possession of our father's house. He spoke at family gatherings about honoring Dad's wishes, by which he meant honoring the wishes he'd written himself. And the family, the aunts, the cousins, our father's friends, treated Marcus as the executor, the decision-maker, the son who was handling everything, and treated me as the daughter who'd gotten less and was, mercifully, being gracious about it. I was not being gracious. I was waiting. And waiting was the thing that almost broke me, because my profession had taught me exactly how a forged will enters the system and gets treated as real, and I knew that every day I let it sit was a day Marcus embedded himself deeper into the estate, made more decisions, moved more assets, created more facts on the ground that would be harder to unwind later. The professional in me screamed to act. The daughter my father had raised held still. Because Dad had said to wait, and Dad understood something I was only beginning to learn, that the second will was irrevocable, that its mere existence in Ms. Okonkwo's office meant that Marcus's document was already dead, and that the difference between acting in the first week and acting in the fourth month was the difference between looking like a grieving sister who was upset about the terms and looking like an executor who had let the fraud document itself. Every day Marcus spent administering the estate under the forged will was a day he was building, in the probate record, the evidence of his own fraud. I didn't need to prove he'd forged it. I just needed to file the real one, and the dates would do the rest. There were nights in those 4 months I almost broke. One night Marcus called, expansive, to say he'd decided to give me an extra $10,000 from his share on top of the 5 Dad had left me, out of love, he said. Out of brotherhood. And I sat on the phone listening to my brother gift me my own money from an estate he'd stolen using a document he'd forged, and I said thank you, and I held the phone away from my face so he wouldn't hear me breathing, and I thought about the second will sitting in Ms. Okonkwo's office like a loaded fact. That was the hardest night. Not because I doubted the plan, but because the performance of generosity was so convincing that for 1 second I wondered whether I was the wrong one. Then I thought about my father's face in that conference room, and I knew I wasn't, and I went to bed, and I waited one more day. So I made one phone call. I called Ms. Okonkwo on a Tuesday morning, from the parking lot of the courthouse where I work, and I said, it's time. She filed the second will that afternoon. Properly, through the correct channels, into the same probate system I process filings for every day, a system I understood better than anyone in my family, a system my brother had never once imagined his little sister knew her way around. The filing was clean, incontestable, and dated 5 months after the document Marcus had produced. In probate, when a later dated will is filed that supersedes an earlier one, the earlier will is revoked. That's not an argument. That's not a family fight. It's the law. Marcus's document, whether it was real, forged, or written on a napkin, was, as of that Tuesday afternoon, legally dead. The real will named me as executor and split the estate equally, and the system that my brother had been running through as though he owned it now belonged to me. Marcus found out the way people find out about probate filings, through his own lawyer, who called him and said, in so many words, that a superseding will had been entered and that his authority over the estate had been revoked and that the new executor was his sister. I'm told he read the filing 3 times. I'm told he called his own lawyer first, sure it was an error, and that his lawyer called Ms. Okonkwo, and that Ms. Okonkwo confirmed it in the flat, professional tone of a lawyer who has been holding a document for 9 months and is entirely unsurprised that it's now needed. There was no argument to be made. A later dated will supersedes an earlier one. That's not a family opinion. It's probate law. The system I work inside every day had done exactly what it's built to do, and my brother was discovering that the machinery he'd assumed was too boring for his little sister to understand was, in fact, the exact machinery that had just quietly, irrevocably, taken everything back. He called me. And for the first time in my adult life, my brother's voice had nothing in it that I recognized. No authority. No warmth as weapon. Just raw, bewildered fury. What did you do? He said. And I said the sentence I'd say again exactly the same way. I said, I made one phone call. Dad signed a second will 5 months before he died, with a lawyer you've never met. It's dated after yours, which means yours is revoked. I'm the executor now. The estate splits 50-50, the way Dad actually wanted. And Marcus, I work in probate. I've processed 100 filings like this. Did you really think the daughter who files wills for a living wouldn't know a forged one when she saw it? Here is where the story becomes a choice, and it is not the choice my family expected. Because I had everything. I was the executor. The forged will was revoked. Marcus had spent 4 months administering an estate under a fraudulent document, and I had, in the probate record, a complete trail of every decision he'd made under false authority, every asset he'd moved, every distribution he'd taken, every honoring Dad's wishes speech built on a lie. I could have referred the forgery. I could have pursued it as a criminal matter. I could have made sure my brother faced not just the loss of the estate but the legal consequences of fabricating a legal document, which, in my state, is a felony. I thought about it. After 4 months of watching my brother play patriarch with my father's things while the family praised him and pitted me, the pull toward maximum consequence was genuine and strong. But I kept asking what I actually wanted underneath the anger, and it wasn't Marcus in a courtroom. It was the estate handled correctly, the way Dad wanted, by the person Dad chose. I already had that. The second will gave me everything I needed. Pursuing the forgery further wouldn't give me a better outcome, it would just give me a destroyed brother, a family in criminal court headlines, and a father's legacy turned into a legal spectacle. The craving to see Marcus charged and the need to honor what Dad had actually wanted were two different things. And I was, even at 26, old enough to tell them apart. So I administered the estate. Correctly, cleanly, the way my profession had trained me. I split it 50-50, exactly as Dad's real will specified. I unwound the decisions Marcus had made under false authority, carefully, methodically, without drama, the way you unwind a filing error, because that's what it was, in the end, a filing error committed by a person who thought the clerk wouldn't notice. I did not refer the forgery. I did not pursue criminal charges. I let the revocation of Marcus's will, and the appointment of his little sister as executor, be the consequence, because for a man who had stood at the head of the table and read a fabricated document aloud to a room full of relatives, there is no punishment more complete than watching the person he dismissed undo every word of it through the very system he thought was beneath her. I want to be honest that I felt the pull of the criminal referral. I sat with the documentation, the forged will on one side, the real will on the other, the dates irreconcilable, and I knew, professionally, that what Marcus had done was a crime, and that the evidence was clean. But I also knew something the anger didn't want to admit. My father had not built the second will to put his son in prison. He'd built it to protect his daughter's share. Those are different things. The second will was a guardrail, not a weapon, and using it as a weapon would have turned my father's act of love into an instrument of destruction. I did not want to be the person who did that to Dad's final careful thing. The 18 months after that were not dramatic. That's the part these stories never show. Marcus did not speak to me for 3 months, and then he did, and then he didn't again, and the on and off went on for a while, the way it does when a person is slowly adjusting to a reality in which they are not who they thought they were. He never apologized cleanly. He came close. Once, he called me and said, "Dad really went to a separate lawyer?" And I said yes. And he said, he knew I'd, and he stopped. And I said, yes. He knew. And there was a long silence, and Marcus said, "I told him I'd handle everything." And I said, "You did. He just didn't believe you'd handle it fairly." It was the truest thing either of us had ever said to the other, and we both let it sit without building on it, because some truths are too heavy to carry further than the sentence they arrive in. There was one moment, a few weeks into the administration, that I keep. Marcus had left a box of Dad's personal things at the house's books, tools, a jacket. I went to pick it up, and at the bottom, under Dad's old drafting set, I found a note in his handwriting. It said, "For Danny. You'll know when to open this." Inside was a photograph of the two of us when I was small, sitting at his desk, and he'd written on the back, "Already filing things. Age 6. I sat on the floor of his empty house and I held that photograph and I understood that my father had not merely planned for what Marcus would do. He had spent my whole life watching me become the person who could handle it. The clerk. The filer. The one who knows the system. He'd seen me becoming her since I was 6 years old, and he'd trusted the becoming. Our Auntie Dad's sister took the longest to come around, because she'd been in the room when Marcus read the first will and she'd spent 4 months pitying me for being the daughter who understood. When she learned about the second will, and about Marcus's document being revoked, she called me and said, "Your father was a careful man." And I said, "He was." And she said, "He chose the right executor." That was as close to an apology as I was going to get from the generation that had watched Marcus perform and assumed the performance was the truth. I let it be enough. There was one afternoon, a few months into administering the estate, that I keep like a photograph. I was sitting at my own desk at the courthouse, processing a routine probate filing for a stranger's family, and I realized I was doing exactly what I'd done for Dad, the same forms, the same system, the same careful attention to whether the document in front of me was real. And I understood, for the first time, that my father hadn't chosen me as executor despite my job. He'd chosen me because of it. He'd seen the thing my family had always found too dull to respect, the clerk, the filer, the person who reads wills for a living, and he'd understood that the only person who could protect his family from his own son was the daughter who knew the system from the inside. My boring career was the whole reason I was safe. People ask me whether it was revenge. I didn't forge a document. I didn't fabricate a will to take more than my share, or stand at the head of a table and perform grief while stealing from my own family. I didn't do a single one of the things the setup seems to promise. Marcus did the forging, his own document's date did the damage, and my father's second will, sitting quietly in a lawyer's office for 9 months, did what no argument of mine ever could have. It spoke in Dad's real voice, with Dad's real wishes, and it revoked every word my brother had written in his name. All I did was make one phone call. One call, to a lawyer my brother didn't know, to enter a will my brother didn't know existed, into a system my brother thought was beneath me. That's it. One phone call, and the daughter who filed things for a living filed the thing that undid everything. Here is what everybody lost. Marcus lost the story, the one where he was the natural heir, the son who handled everything, the one Dad would have wanted in charge. He lost it to a second will, dated later, signed properly, in a lawyer's office he'd never heard of. But he gained, eventually, the knowledge that our father had seen him clearly and loved him anyway and chosen to protect both his children from the worst version of the one, and that's a harder, realer thing to carry than any inheritance. The aunts and cousins lost the comfortable narrative, the son who stepped up, the daughter who understood. They're still adjusting. And I lost something too, and it wasn't Marcus. I lost the belief that being good at my job, and being quiet, and being the one who files things, would be enough on its own for my family to see me. It wasn't. It took my father walking into a lawyer's office and signing a document that said, in legal language, what he'd never quite said at dinner, that the quiet daughter was the one he trusted, and the loud son was the one he'd built a wall against, and the wall was made of exactly the material the quiet daughter worked with every day. I keep the second will in a folder at my desk now. Not a copy, the original, the one with Dad's signature and Ms. Okonkwo's witness stamp and the date that killed my brother's version. Because that document is the thing that was actually true. My family could listen to Marcus read a fabricated will and nod along. They could pity me for getting $5,000 and the understanding of a passive daughter. They could not, in the end, argue with a later dated will, properly executed, filed by the one person in the family who knew exactly how to file it. They thought I was the one who understood. It turned out I was the one our father trusted with the truth, and the system, and one phone call. So if there's someone in your life who's taken what was meant to be shared and dressed it up as someone else's wishes, someone who's counting on the fact that you're too quiet, too passive, too grateful for scraps to fight back, ask yourself one thing tonight. Are you actually passive? Or have you just been waiting, the way my father taught me to wait, for the right moment to make one phone call and let the system do what it was built to do? Thank you for staying with this story to the end. Every character and event in it is fictional, written for reflection and entertainment. But if any of it felt familiar, I hope it leaves you with this: the quiet one, the one who files things, the one the family decided was harmless, that person is sometimes the most dangerous person in the room. Not because they're vengeful, but because they understand the machinery everyone else ignores. And when someone tries to use that machinery against them, all it takes is one phone call from the person who knows how it actually works, and the whole performance falls apart. Know your system. Trust your record. And when the time is right, make the call.